Hello, insiders, and welcome back to the Inside Job with Philip Cox. And that's me, Philip Cox, here with you. It's been a couple of weeks, and that's all right. We are just doing what we can do, and that's what you can do. What you can do is what you can do, and that, you just have to be okay with that. No, we have been in the throes of baseballing. We've been in the throes of violining and a bit of horse riding for our daughter. And I've been spiritually directing and doing all of those things. And I've actually been getting ready for some really, really cool things that are going to be coming to the podcast soon, because we are going to be not stopping reading the Substack posts, because that's definite. We're gonna be anchoring to that, obviously, because that's what we're doing here. And we're also going to begin to add into that some conversations with some really, really cool people. And I'm really excited about a couple of the ones that are coming up. Some people have been friends of mine for a long time, and some people have I haven't met, but I either admire them or admire their work, or we've met briefly. But we're going to begin to have some chats, because you know what's good is chatting with actual people. Isn't that a concept? We're gonna talk to real people, and so I hope that you're as excited about that as I am. So today we are not speaking to anybody. We are going to be reading the most recent Substack post, and this post is, we've kind of wrapped up our ritual series, and there's been a couple of Dadco chats that have come out now. And so now I want to start something new, and this is something that's been ticking along in my brain and rolling around in my plans probably since about 2020, 19 or 20, when this idea first came to me. And it's taken on a couple of different forms. I've had a couple of miss starts or stutter starts, and it just hasn't quite landed where I want it to be. And I'm not 100% sure exactly what this is ultimately going to look like, but I want to start stretching out these muscles again in this particular project. And I'm just calling, for the time being, the working title is just the Earth and Skies Project. And I'm really excited about it. It kind of aligns and brings together a couple of my favorite topics in the whole world, and one of those is spiritual formation and how it is that God changes our lives, how it is that transformation actually takes place, how it is that we can begin to cooperate with the work that the Spirit is already doing, because the Holy Spirit is doing work. The question is, are we aware of that work? Is the activity that we are doing in our life, is it staying in flow with the work of Spirit, or is it counteracting the work of Spirit? How can we know what the Spirit is up to? And so that's kind of the work of spiritual formation. What is the Spirit doing, and how can I best cooperate that for my transformation into Christ-likeness, for the sake of others and the sake of the world? So it brings in that passion of mine, the spiritual formation space, but it also brings in the first few pages of the ancient Hebrew and Christian scriptures, which is the passage in Genesis 1. And that is a page or two out of scripture that has been really, I think it's fair to say, really misunderstood, probably very badly handled, especially by modern interpreters and modern readers. And I love the idea of reclaiming these early pages of Scripture. And that has driven me to spend hundreds of hours in this text and reading about this text and exploring the depths of wisdom in this text, because this is ultimately what this is a wisdom text, and it has been being treated like a historical or a scientific text, and that that thins out the depth. It rises to read it that way, to read it so simplistically and so flatly, brings it out of its depth and out of its richness to the simplest and most surface level reading, and it really does a terrible injustice to the brilliance of this text. And so I want to help reclaim what this text is actually doing, what it would have actually meant to its original hearers and its original audience, and how powerful and provocative of a text it actually was. It is an origin story, but it's doing beautiful theology through the power of narrative, through the power of poetry, through the power of story, because ultimately the stories we tell shape who we become. The stories we tell shape who we become. And so I want to reclaim this as a sacred story that helps shape our vision of the world and who we are and what God is like and what that partnership is like. And so that whole narrative and that whole poetic narrative of Genesis 1 is this beautiful picture of how God enters into a dark and chaotic space to bring about something that is beautiful and something that is others-centric and others-focused, and how this divine breath goes out to do that beautiful work of taking our dark and chaotic brokenness and using it, reordering it, putting boundaries in place, doing all these beautiful acts to bring about a flourishing garden that humans can thrive in. And if we look around at our world, we could probably do with a bit more thriving, and we could do a bit more with the cultivation of our spaces so that thriving can actually take place, not for the few, but thriving can take place for the many. And so that's what this project's going to be about. And so I'm going to want to look at it piece by piece, word by word, not literally word by word, but I'm going to take the main chunks, the main diamonds, the main bricks of gold in this poetic narrative and explore them and explore what it would have meant in its ancient setting and what it would mean to us if we were to hear the wisdom that's offered in this text. And so that is what we're doing today. And so this first post in this Earth and Skies project is called Roo-awk, and you gotta kind of gargle at the back of your throat when you say roo-awk, and we're going to explore all about this beautiful and sacred and wise word. I looked up and I saw a small murder of crows stuck in midair. And first aside, did you know that a grouping of crows is called a murder? Very interesting. Okay. That's the end of that aside. I just thought you might want to know. I looked up and I saw a small murder of crows stuck in midair. Their wings flapped. They strained to make headway, but there they hung, suspended in flight. I've discovered an aspect of living in a city situated near the coast is the cyclone season that drops by each year. An aspect within this aspect is the accompanying tropical storm winds that also come rolling in off the vast Pacific Ocean. Growing up in landlocked Huntsville, Alabama, in the south of the United States, kept me and my brothers at least 6 hours away from anything remotely coastal or remotely tropical. The particular gale on this particular day howled with a particular intensity. Its intensity bent our banana tree into its eponymous shape and pressed pause on the flight plan of these crows that were frozen above my head. At the time, I was ankle-deep in learning vocabulary words and parsing verbal stems for my Hebrew classes. My lecturers told us that one of the best ways to learn a new language was to learn to think in that language. In other words, when you see a house, don't think house, think buy it, which is the Hebrew word for house. Buy it. So, standing there, crows overhead, and me in awe of the power of this wind, I said out loud, roo-awk, which is pronounced roo-awk. And that is unsurprisingly the Hebrew word for wind. And wind is a good translation for roo-awk. But in ancient Hebrew, like in a lot of ancient languages, there are significantly fewer words than there are in modern languages. For instance, ancient biblical Hebrews only got about 8,800 words, and even those are only based on about 1,800 root words, where consider that next to English, which has got over 400,000 words. And even the ones in active circulation are like 28,000. So multiples and multiples of ancient Hebrew. So because of this, lots of words do linguistic heavy lifting by taking on multiple meanings. Often, these multiple meanings have increasing layers of not just meaning, but layers of wisdom and layers of insight as you peel each one back. And ruach is one of those words. So, yes, at its first level, ruach simply means wind. And if you actually check the footnotes in my post, I've got lots of footnotes that have the particular passages from the Hebrew scriptures where it's obvious that the writers are thinking of wind. What is wind? Well, I write that it's the blowy thing out in the air that makes the trees dance and the clouds fly. I like that I use the word blowy thing. That's what the wind is. It's what stopped the crows over my head mid-flight. But what is it that causes this wind? Well, that's what brings the next meaning of ruach to us. The second layer of meaning for ruach is translated as breath. Now, why would a language use the same word for wind and for breath? Actually, if you just take a few minutes and think about it and ponder it, it's not actually too far-fetched. Imagine picking up, for example, imagine going outside and picking and blowing. You see the little dandelion that hasn't flowered yet. You see it in its pre-flowered state, and you see the white fluffy ball, the dandelion. You know that's called a dandelion clock. That little fluffy white thing that you blow, that's called the dandelion clock. I didn't know that before I started writing, but as I researched, I found out that that's called a dandelion clock. So imagine blowing the seeds from a dandelion clock. And what happens? It scatters all throughout the air. It goes and plants its seeds all over our yard, and we have lots more dandelions pop up. Well, how do we do that? Well, our mouth produces a teeny micro wind. And it's not as strong as the wind out there in the trees, but it's strong enough to scatter this dandelion clock's seeds into the air. However, unlike the massive winds that are out there blowing, our breath is generated from within our own body. It's like the wind, but it's like the wind in a personal form, a personal wind. So for wind and breath, Hebrew uses the same word, and that word is ruach. Say it with me now, ruach. So for an ancient thinker, and ancient thinkers thought in ancient ways, and that's okay because they lived in ancient times, and we need to respect that and honor that when we enter an ancient text. We need to try to think like an ancient thinker. So for an ancient thinker, the question might have gone something like, well, if I'm generating this little mini wind from within my body, then what, or rather who, is generating those epic winds out there? And they said epic lots way back in biblical Hebrew. In the world view of these ancient cultures, the elements of the natural world, things like wind and storms and sun and moon and all the elements of the natural world were seen as directly caused by or the actual physical embodiments of divine beings. And these divine beings were part of a widely populated spiritual world. Widely populated spiritual world. Thus, the wind was thought of as being or being blown by the gods. For instance, if you look at the Egyptians, the Egyptian creation myth saw that the winds were being blown by the god Shu, who was the god of air. And in Mesopotamian mythology, Enlil was the God who controlled the wind, who controlled the air, and controlled the storms, both in life-giving and in destructive ways. Tarhuna also controlled storms in the stories that are found in the Hittite culture. And all of these, the Egyptian and the Mesopotamian and the Hittite and Sumerian, all of these cultures were neighbors of ancient Israel, and their cultures and their languages highly influenced the world and the world view of ancient Israel. And yet you're going to see, as we will explore in this series, we will see how the Israelites they had the same worldview, and they begin to tell a vastly different story. So this divine breath, going back to wind and breath, this divine breath could be seen in action as it carried the birds through the skies, swept over a mountainside, or blew down your cousin Bezalel's by it. And 6 points if you got that callback. This brings us to the third meaning of roo-awk, and it's where things start to get really interesting. So, roo-awk, it shows up on the first page of both the Jewish and Christian scriptures, like we talked about in the intro. And I want to see if you can spot it. So we're talking about wind and we're talking about breath, but we're looking for the third meaning of roo-awk, and I want to see if you can spot it. Here we go. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was formless and empty, and darkness was on the face of the deep waters, and the Spirit of God hovered over the waters. That's Genesis 1, verses 1 and 2. So, could you see it? Did you hear it? Do you hear a wind or a breath word in that verse? I'll read it again. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was formless and empty, and darkness was on the face of the deep waters, and the Spirit of God hovered over the waters. So it may not be immediately apparent, and that's all right, but roo-awk is in there. Roo-awk means, number one, it means wind. It means breath. Lastly, it means spirit. These ancient writers say that Ruach Elohim, the Spirit of God, moves out over the waters. And thanks to brilliant, hardworking biblical scholars who work to translate these ancient texts, we get to read this passage in English. And we read it in English as the Spirit of God, Ruach Elohim. Another equally accurate translation of this verse would be, and the breath of God moved over the face of the waters, because breath and ruach, same word. So you could say the breath of God moved out over the face of the waters. Or, as it's translated in the NRSV, that a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. Those are equally accurate translations as the Spirit of God. And translators have to make those kind of decisions. And there are reasons why they do. But all three of those work. Ruach means breath, it means wind, it means spirit. Now, we saw earlier that how the connection between breath and wind, that kind of makes sense. We kind of get that. But spirit, why do they choose to say spirit? What's going on in this ancient text that they would say there's a third meaning? Why not just stick with wind and breath? Well, the connection is about movement. And not only just movement, it's the ability to generate that movement. Ruach is the energy that animates what is otherwise motionless. In this epic, poetic narrative of Genesis 1, this wind, this divine spirit breath, blows and begins the creation process by separating the deep waters. It begins ordering the unproductive landscape and speaking words to call into being. You use breath to speak. So speaking into being what has been created, and then to go on and name what has been created. So that's what the Spirit of God hovering over these waters, God uses His breath, His wind, His animating energy to begin to speak into an unproductive, chaotic landscape, to begin separating and putting boundaries in place, to begin to bring out something beautiful. Ruach is the energy that animates what is otherwise motionless. And when God breathes into something, it comes to life. So as the Hebrew scriptures begin to unfold, its writers use roo-awk to talk about humans and animals' breath. They both have roo-awk in them. It talks about humans and animals' breath, saying that that breath has been given as a loan to them from the divine. God has loaned that breath to them. And so as they die and they breathe their final breath, that's them handing their roo-awk, their animating, life-giving energy back to God. We see that in the Psalms. We see that in the prophets that speak of these animals, and Ecclesiastes that speak of these animals giving their breath back to God, and that their whole life is energized and given to them by the Creator. These writers, they saw that life was a gift that was animated by the source who gives life to all creation. So roo-awk isn't just about this powerful force of nature out there rearranging the clouds, but it's also the air that I'm breathing. It's the same air, the same wind, the same stuff, the animating energy that's giving me life right here and right now. And that life is a gift. Now, why does any of this matter? Because some might say, yeah, but aren't these just ancient ways of thinking? Aren't these just ancient ways of talking about science that now we know better? Aren't these just outdated stories? And I would say, yeah, fair. I hear all that. Totally fair. The deal is, these texts aren't about that. These texts aren't trying to tell us about the scientific makeup of the world. These have a fundamentally different purpose. It's giving us the why, not the what, which we keep talking about. It just keeps popping up. The why, not the what. It's saying what is going on in the world, not from a scientific, but it's giving us the question of meaning, the question of purpose, the question of wisdom. It's giving us a why, not the what. So, this way of looking still invites us, those who have eyes to see. It's beginning to change. And this is the beauty of wisdom text. It doesn't tell us what to see. It doesn't tell us what to see. It teaches us how to see, and how to see everything with a different set of eyes. You could say with the eyes of wisdom. So the invitation to our highly, and I put secular world, and I put that in quotes, secular, because a lot of times what people in Christian circles, they want to talk about what's Christian or what's not Christian. That's not at all what I mean by secular. I mean secular in its more exact meaning, which just means in our post-Enlightenment world, we've created this line that says, well, religion is over here, and then what's real is what I can look at through a microscope or through a telescope, and that's what the materiality of the world, that's what's real. And then yes, you can have your religion, and but that's completely disconnected from the rest of life. And if you want to have that, it can kind of sit over here in this compartmentalized religious space, but then we can get about the business of the rest of our life, the real stuff of life. So the invitation here that I want to point to and keep bringing us back to this secularized view of the world, is to see that the idea of spirit, according to the Bible, is never a stagnant, an ephemeral, or a lofty religious idea or a religious word. The divine spirit, according to these Hebrew texts, is gritty, it's powerful, it inspires concrete action, it sparks movement that's intimately tied to justice, for care for creation, and care for others. And that's one of the reasons that we've lost this notion, while there's been this loss of interest in religion, because religion has lost its actual real spirit. It's not tied to justice. It's not caring for creation, and it does care for others in a way, but oftentimes more than anything, it becomes this echo chamber that is the self-feeding, self-nurturing bubble that seems disconnected with the suffering and the difficulty of life. And that is fundamentally, if you run into a church or you run into a religious space that is disconnected from justice, social justice, creation care, care for those who are in the margins of society, you're encountering a group that has lost touch with spirit. Holy and sacred roo-awk has nothing to do with a God who's far off and disinterested, but one that is deeply entrenched in the details of our lives and the details of the life of our neighbor, and who's right here in this moment giving us breath and giving us presence in the middle of our pain, in the middle of our struggle, in the middle of our joy, our elation, in the middle of awe and wonder. It's about the sense of aliveness and even our creativity as we move around in the world. Roo-awk is about the details and the meaning and the purpose and the animating energy of all of our life. Roo-awk is what connects us with being itself. For these ancient thinkers, a spiritual life was not something outside of ourselves, not that secularized view. Spiritual life wasn't something outside of ourselves, like a shoe or a jacket that could be simply taken on and off at will. Instead, roo-awk is woven into the very fabric of creation. Life is a breath borrowed and shared, and something that exists as long and only as it's connected to the divine. And as long as it flows to us from the divine, we have life. These ideas are suggested and explored in detail by the brilliant French philosopher Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. And he said he was a French philosopher that wrote largely in the middle of the 20th century. And he talked about our spiritual life. He said, the spiritual life isn't something that we choose, but it's something that we are. His actual quote is that we are not human beings having a spiritual experience. Instead, we are spiritual beings having a human experience. This means that the whole of our life is an act of spirit. The question then isn't, do I want to have a spiritual life? But instead, what kind of spiritual life am I going to live? In the worldviews of these ancient writers, these Hebrew scriptures, these brilliant writers, there are multiple spirits that could animate a person. It's not all that spirit of creation, that spirit of goodness. There's lots of other spirits out there. And I can already hear the groans. I feel them within myself. There are plenty of people and plenty of traditions that take these kind of like spirit ideas way too far, and they look and they see a spirit, bad or good, behind every bush, or telling them to drink orange juice, not apple juice, all that stuff. You probably know people like that, and that's not what we're talking about. But it's also not hard if we think about spirit as not this little horned figure with a pitchfork, but if we think about spirits like this animating energy, if you're like me, it's not hard to acknowledge that there are many times what feel like competing spirits, competing energies that are locked inside of me in this tug of war, things that are pulling me to help or to resist or to get in flow with the Creator, or to push against and do things that are selfishly motivated, when really what we're being called to is to pour out. And we are a society that continues to pour in. There are spirits and energies locked in a tug of war in us. That is not hard to see. And we don't have to give these these spirits horns and a pitchfork to believe that those energies are at work in the world. Now, in modern day, these energies, these driving forces, we can talk about them in a lot of different ways. And I happen to be what's the word? Fond. I happen to be fond of terms like your truest self, your false self, terms like essence. What's your essence? And then what's being driven by essence and what's being driven by ego? Those terms have bubbled up to the surface in recent years. They were first introduced, true self and false self were introduced by this psychologist named Donald Winnicott. He was a British psychologist, and they've been adopted since then by a lot of spiritual teachers, most notably in the Christian tradition by the contemplative writer and Trappist monk Thomas Merton. And then Franciscan Father Richard Rohr writes about the true self and the false self. And these are really, really important ways to begin rethinking and reintegrating this idea of spirit and what's animating our decisions and our being in the world. So ego or false self in this context, thinking about it like this, is similar to what the Apostle Paul in his letters calls the flesh. He talks about spirit and flesh. Well, that's kind of like what we're talking about with ego or false self. The false self is the part of us that tries to function from a place of willpower, of personal strength and independence. It's that I'm tightening and gripping with my muscles as much as I can, and ultimately, of course, we know that all willpower ultimately gives out if that's all that's driving us. And usually, that willpower, that independence, that closing off of ourself is usually driven by a deeply embedded sense of fear, of lack. That's what leads to our grasp and our gripping for control. And it ends up fostering this narrative inside of us that says, there's not enough. There's not enough resource, there's not enough time, there's not enough love, there's not enough safety. And so I need to fight for and protect what I've got. The unfortunate result of having the ego and the false self as our primary driving energy. Now, I'm not saying that the ego is bad. The ego has its place, and the ego does really important work in the structuring of who we are and in the world. But as our driving energy, the ego is important. The ego just isn't you. There's a deeper you than the ego. But to have the ego as our driving energy, ultimately, it never brings us what we're really longing for. It never brings us to love. It never brings us to presence, and therefore is a self-defeating project. And the more we cling to it and the more we grasp for it, it ends up coming at a tremendous cost to ourselves and to the people around us. We can see this kind of cost, this kind of roo-awk, the cost of this spirit playing out in the spirit of our age, the zeitgeist of our culture. And it's a culture that is producing more and more people who are increasingly frantic and hurried and anxious and addicted and depressed and over-medicated, just to name a few of the fruits of this false self, this ego-driven roo-awk. So it is a roo-awk, it is a spirit, it is an animating energy, but I would argue that it's one that pushes against rather than flows with the roo-awk that we see at work in this ancient Hebrew creation story. Essence, or true self, on the other hand, is a driving force that begins with a deep knowing, a deep knowledge that we are already loved. And it's from that spirit that flows a healthy care of self and a narrative that says, you know what? There's actually always enough, and I always have enough to share. And therefore, because there's enough, I can give freely. When we're grounded and when we're living from our truest self, and I would argue that that is the self that God creates us to be, when we're actually following the blueprint to what it means to actually be human. And I would say that that's what Jesus shows us. He reveals to us what it actually means to be human, fully known by God, fully knowing who He is in God, from that place, we can see the world. We can see ourselves and everything around us. We see the interconnectedness of everything, that my actions deeply impact your actions, and you are not separate to me, and they are not different to me, different but not separate. We see our interconnectedness. We see our need for interdependence, and we live from a place of ultimate goodness. This animating spirit, this roo-awk, is about propelling us forward. It's about bringing new life. It's about expanding beyond ourselves for the good of others. I would say for the good of all. That is precisely what we see happening in this ancient 3,500-year-old Hebrew text. God breathes roo-awk, this powerful wind, to separate the chaotic and the unfruitful waters. He speaks into being beauty and goodness, and he creates a world that's full of potential, that is beneficial not just for the creator, but especially for the ones who have been created. Now, this kind of story about a God who would be providing for his creation, that flies in the face of every other creation story that floated around at that time, and I would argue in this time. In those stories, the humans were created for the sole purpose of being slaves. And what was the job of those slaves? To provide food and drink for the gods. And how do you provide food and drink for the gods in ancient perspective? Well, who's the god? Well, he is represented by the king on the throne in the temple and his whole royal court. So everybody that's not a part of the royal family and the king, their job, according to their origin story, and origin stories tell you who you are and what your job is and how you're supposed to live. You, if you're not born in the temple family, the royal family, your job is to provide and live to provide food and drink for the gods, aka the king. So to have a story, an origin story, about a God who cares for his creation is a fundamentally different kind of story. And you could imagine coming against those other stories and saying, that's not the purpose of humanity. That's not what we're here for. That's not what the gods are like, aka we can't set up our systems. We can't set up our government in that way, where everybody at the bottom is providing for those at the top. Do you see how charged and politically motivated and what this counter narrative would have done in those regions of the world at that time? That's what these stories are about. They are telling a fundamentally different story about the way that we order ourselves and the way that we order our life and what God is actually like. Now, thinking back to these crows that were stranded over my house, that the wind had stuck up in the sky, that they couldn't move, I'm reminded that there are real energies at work within me. It's so easy for me to simply live on autopilot, all of us, to just wake up and go the path of least resistance. And yet, every day, I'm reminded that I have the opportunity to choose which energies, which spirit, which roo-awk I get to partner with that day. Which ones am I going to push against? Which ones are proving that they're unhelpful in bringing me to who it is that I actually want to be, who I'm created to be, my truest and my deepest self? My daily task has become to investigate my motivations as I go through my day, stepping outside of myself and beginning to ask the question, what kind of roo-awk is animating my activity right now? What's motivating my actions and my reactions and my responses? Am I being motivated by fear and grasping and control? Am I being motivated to create a better world for not just me, But for the ones that are around me, the one that's across from me, the one I'm in disagreement with right now, am I willing to see my interconnectedness with that person that's frustrating me right now? What's driving my reaction? What's driving my responses? What roo-awk am I partnering with today? A simple glance at today's headlines, news, political, whatever. It's easy to see that there are always all these other people, all these other systems, all these things around us that have failed at creating the kind of world we want to live in. And we can point our fingers at them and say, it's their fault. It's that party's fault. It's that party's fault. It's that, all that. We can do that. We can scapegoat all we want. But if we're willing to let these ancient Hebrew writers impact the way we see the world, we can begin to see that Ruach isn't just power outside of ourselves making things move and making things change, but we begin to see that there is a tremendous power inside of us as well. That is where our journey towards awareness and our journey towards transformation for ourselves and transformation for the sake of the world. That's why we're being transformed. We're not just being transformed so we can have a better life. We're being transformed so that we can make the world better for all. But it starts with the ruach inside of us. When we realize it's inside of us as well as outside of us, our journey towards awareness and transformation for ourselves and for the sake of the world can really begin. And that is the end of that post. And if you want to read it and you want to look at those footnotes, you want to click any of those links, you can go to, now my name is spelt with one L. So if you put two, you'll never find it. philipcox.substack.com. And you can check it out there. You can subscribe. You can do all those kinds of things, whatever. But that's where you can keep up with the latest writings, and you can listen to the podcasts on there as well. Feel free to share this if you liked it. And until next time, peace and joy.